For the 1907 pants, you need 2 backs cut in wool, 2 fronts cut in wool with the pockets marked, a 1 1/4 inch strip for the belt loops. If your fabric is thin, allow seam allowance. Mine is thick, so there's no seam allowance. Waistband interfacing of hymo and lining, fork support, 2 tabs in wool, 2 pieces of press-on tricot, 2 pieces of lining, 2 pieces of fly, 2 pieces of tricot, 4 pieces of lining, and the pocket, 2 pieces of cotton, and facings for both sides. 4 suspender buttons. A 1-inch sliding buckle or vest buckle. 2 pants hooks and bars, and some twill tape. If you're planning to do welt pockets on these pants for extra credit, use the instructions for a single welt pocket from Couture. Serge the 3 sides of the pocket facing pieces that do not have any notches, and then top stitch them to the right side of the pocket bags and flat line them just outside the stitching line. Notice that there is a large and a small on each pocket. First, stitch the pocket wrong sides together across the bottom, turn, and top stitch on the same line. The side of the pocket with the small facing is the front. The deeper facing goes in the back, so this is a left side pocket. Pull the back of the pocket aside and stitch the front of the pocket to the front of the pants, in from the side and in from the stitching line about 1/4 inch, and then back out at the notch. Clip right into the corners. Press the edge so the seam rolls slightly to the inside, and top stitch. Trim the seam allowance above the waist and cross-stitch the pocket bag both layers to just above the waistline. Thread mark the location of the belt loop and tailor base to the front of the pants. Lay the front pieces on the table wrong side up and mark the left A and the right C. Lay out and label the pieces of your fly as shown in the book, except for numbers 4 and 5, which are incorrect. So number 1 is the lining, labeled A and E. Number 2 is the lining, labeled C and B. Number 3 is cloth and iron-on interfacing, labeled B and C. And number 4 is lining, labeled D and E, and cloth, labeled E and D. Stitch center front closed between the 2 notches on the pattern twice. Stitch lining piece AE, number 1, to the front of the left side and use it to clean center front. Finish stitching about 3/8 of an inch beyond the opening. This will be the side that has the buttonholes and the overlap. The C side is the side that has the buttons and the extension. Match up pieces 2 and 3, the lining and the wool with the tricot, and stitch the outside edge Remark the stitching line on the inside and flat line everything together along edge C. Stitch line C of the fly to the right front of the pants and press all the seam allowance toward the body. Serge all the seam allowance together. Take pieces 4 and 5, put them face to face, and stitch line D. Turn and press, again cheating the seam line to the inside, and remark the buttonholes. Make and cut the buttonholes. Make sure that you have the notch on the inside of your piece and line it up with the front of the pants so that it sits just inside the facing. Pin the buttonhole piece to the facing piece and then stitch line E and serge. Turn everything back to the face. So now you have the extension, the buttonholes, and the overlap. Line everything up so that you can't see the seam between the front and the extension and pin it all together. First, stitch the facing down to this point. Below this pin, join all the layers together to include the underlap. Press tricot onto the wool of the tabs, bag it out with the lining, clip, turn, and top stitch. Lay the tab on the back pieces how it's drawn on the pattern and stitch right next to the stitching line. Trim it away to almost nothing and enclose it in the dart. Stitch, press, and serge the side seam. I pressed everything to the back above the pocket because there was so much thickness, and then clipped it below and pressed it open so it would be thin in the leg. To make the belt loops, serge the long edges, press it into thirds, and top stitch. Then cut them into 3-inch segments. Flatline the hymo to the lining by machine. Fold the lower edge up, pink, and stitch. Be gentle because the back of it can stretch quite easily. Double check it against the pattern before moving on to the next step. Pin the belt loops in place so that the raw edge extends into the seam allowance above the waist by only 1/4 inch and tack in place. Trim the seam allowance away on the buttonhole piece just a little bit, about 1/2 inch below the stitching line to 1/4 inch at center front. Lay the facing on the face of the pants and stitch just along the top edge. Trim, clip, understitch, and press it down so that just a little bit of the wool is showing above the facing. Tack the bottom of the waistband at the dart, side seam, and anywhere else it seems like it's going to flop. Fold the raw edge of the belt loop under 1/4 inch, lay it in place, and top stitch across the bottom. Serge center back with the facing flattened down, leaving as much seam allowance as possible at the top and narrowing to 1/2 inch by the bend. Stitch and serge the inseam, then starting at center front, stitch all the way up to center back, press the seam allowances open, and tack them down at the waistband. Fold the fork in half on the bias and serge off the seam allowances together. Lay the fork so that the center point sits at center front and the edges are tacked along the inseams. Slip stitch the facing down on the center front of the underlap side. On the overlap side, stitch the hooks before sliding the facing underneath, and then follow the directions on page 161 that involve wrapping a twill tape over the end.